In April 1967, a cabal of junior officers launched a military coup in Greece. Arresting thousands, the junta toppled the country's parliamentary democracy and installed an oppressive dictatorship. Unlike other military takeovers in the Cold War era, the Greek coup had not taken place in some remote third world country. Greece was a NATO ally on the front lines of Cold War-divided Europe. The coup raised troubling questions for the Western alliance over its commitment to defending democracy within its own ranks. 4 years later, Greece was still under martial law. The junta now enjoyed the full backing of NATO's senior partner, the United States. In Washington, President Richard Nixon is heard on the White House tapes discussing the junta with Greek-American businessman and longtime crony Tom Pappas. "Look, I'm the best friend they got," he told Pappas. "If I had not been in this office, they'd be right down the tubes." What was behind Nixon's boast? How and why did he use the U.S. presidency to keep the Greek dictators in power? These are the questions addressed in Nixon versus Europe, Greece, in the Tangles of the Cold War. The coup had taken place while Lyndon Johnson was still U.S. president. In Washington, official reaction was strangely muted. At the White House, Johnson maintained a studied silence. A week later, the State Department expressed its regrets, but also gratification at the regime's continued devotion to NATO. Publicly, it urged a return to constitutional rule. But behind the scenes, the State Department regarded as acceptable the junta's plans for a new constitution based on what U.S. officials called the Turkish model. That model made the military a fourth branch of government with autonomous control over defense and foreign affairs. It placed ideological restrictions on the political parties allowed to run for parliament. An embargo on heavy arms deliveries was also imposed, presumably giving the American government leverage over the regime. But the embargo involved a politically useful deception. Evading congressional scrutiny, the Pentagon, in dollar terms, maintained military aid at pre-coup levels. Keeping the Greek military supplied with arms, the Johnson government was thus able to maintain a semblance of disapproval for domestic political purposes, as a White House aide would put it. But that semblance of disapproval was repeatedly put to the test by arbitrary arrests, military trials for political offenses, and alarming reports of torture. In the U.S. Congress and parliaments of Europe, the junta was faced by threats of boycotts and sanctions. Then, in June, the Six-Day War broke out in the Middle East. The Pentagon used the war to dramatize the strategic importance of its bases in Greece, and to good effect. Johnson ordered the State Department to quietly normalize relations with the junta. In Europe, reaction to the April coup was sharply different. Europeans were alarmed that fascism had once again appeared on their continent. They took action at the Council of Europe. The Council had been created following World War II as a collective guarantee of democracy. Greece had been among the first to sign the Council's landmark Human Rights Convention. Now, 4 member states, 3 of them also NATO allies, initiated the Greek case. Over the next months, The council methodically investigated allegations of torture and the junta's egregious violations of democratic rights. Meanwhile, in the United States, events portended political change. In early 1968, the Tet Offensive led to a collapse of American public support for Johnson's controversial war in Vietnam. That fall, Richard Nixon won election as U.S. President. He took the oath of office in January 1969. On both sides of the Atlantic, the next 12 months would be pivotal for Greece's democratic cause. Nixon came to power promising to bring an end to the discredited war in Vietnam, but Greece was also on his agenda. The new president had a major policy change in mind. Nixon wanted to legitimize the regime by removing the stigma of the heavy arms embargo. After all, the dictatorship was staunchly anti-communist and had earned the confidence of U.S. officials as a guarantor of American strategic interests in the region. Lifting the embargo would send a strong signal to friend and foe alike that Greece's military dictators now enjoyed the full public backing of the United States. The political dynamics around making that move, however, dictated caution. The tactical issue, explained National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, was how to stage resumption of military aid without triggering a sharp reaction in NATO capitals and renewed attacks in Congress. Meanwhile, the Council of Europe was steadily building the case against the junta by sending missions to Greece and taking testimony from torture victims and persecuted public figures. The Council put the question of Greek expulsion on the agenda of the ministerial meeting set for December 1969. The prospect of Greek expulsion set the stage for diplomatic confrontations between the United States and a number of its allies in Europe. In these confrontations, Greece's exiled political leaders came to play a prominent role. Within Greece, political life remained on lockdown, its politicians immobilized by the threat of arrest, violent interrogation, and imprisonment. By contrast, Greek leaders in exile could at least speak and act freely. Two of them, Constantine Karamanlis and Andreas Papandreou, made particularly good use of that freedom to advance Greece's democratic cause. The two figures were vastly different in status and outlook. Karamanlis was widely esteemed in the West for having led Greece's recovery following the Second World War. Devoted to the West, he was also wed to the hardline anti-communist right and the continued suppression of the left following its defeat in the Civil War. When the coup plotters struck in 1967, however, Karamanlis was no longer in Greece. In 1963, his 8 years as prime minister had ended when he lost in elections to Papandreou's father, the aging liberal George Papandreou. In despair, Karamanlis went into self-exile in Paris. During the dictatorship, Greeks of all stripes, including those on the communist left, looked to him as a potential savior. They saw him as uniquely positioned to secure Washington's backing for abandoning the junta in favor of a peaceful return to civilian rule under his guidance. In contrast, Andreas Papandreou was a controversial newcomer. In the same year that Karamanlis made his exit, Papandreou entered Greek politics from the United States after a 20-year academic career. As a rising figure in the economics profession, he had become richly connected with the liberal intelligentsia that President John F. Kennedy drew upon for his new frontier. In Washington, American officials viewed Papandreou's foray into Greek politics with favor. As a minister in his father's centrist government, however, he soon clashed with U.S. officials over Cold War-inspired plans to divide Cyprus between Greece and Turkey. As a tribune for the aspirations of ordinary Greeks, he enjoyed a meteoric rise in popularity. Now considered a dangerous leftist by Cold War hawks, he was a prime target of the 1967 coup. After spending 8 months as a political prisoner, he went into exile to found the Pan-Hellenic Liberation Movement. Despite their deep differences, Karamanlis and Papandreou found common cause when the question of Greek expulsion was placed on the Council of Europe's agenda. As it turned out, they had their work cut out for them. The outcome of the expulsion vote was uncertain, Karamanlis would write. Behind the scenes, the American government had gotten involved, urging forbearance for the junta. Ahead of the December meeting, Nixon dispatched Secretary of State William Rogers to Europe to lobby against ousting Greece.